Hey guys, tonight we are building without nails. The blacksmith uses fire, but we use geometry. We are joining the medieval joiner. We are going to lock solid oak together using friction and precision. This is a story about grain, patience, and the perfect fit. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. Now, hear the plane shave the wood, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The workshop is quiet. It is late afternoon in the year of our Lord 1342, and the light that comes through the single window is golden and thick, like honey poured slowly from a jar. The window itself is small, set high in the wall, and the glass is thick and uneven, full of bubbles and ripples that bend the light into shifting patterns on the earthen floor. Outside, somewhere in the distance, you can hear the church bell tolling the hour of vespers, but inside this space, inside these four timber-framed walls, time moves differently. It moves with the rhythm of the plane. It moves with the patience of oak. The sharp smells of wood. Not just any wood, but oak specifically. English oak, Quercus raba. The smell is rich and slightly sweet, with undertones of tannin that catch in the back of your throat if you breathe deeply enough. Mixed with that is the scent of beeswax, which the joiner keeps in a leather pouch hanging from a nail driven into one of the wall posts. The wax is used to lubricate the sole of his planes, to help them glide smoothly across the surface of the wood. When you rub it between your fingers, it becomes soft and pliable, releasing its gentle honey smell into the air. The floor is covered with shavings. They lie in drifts against the walls, curled like the hair of angels, translucent when you hold them up to the light. Some are thick and coarse, the color of wheat chaff. Others are thin as parchment, so delicate they flutter when you walk past them. They accumulate throughout the day, and at night the apprentice will sweep them into a basket to be used as kindling or as bedding for the animals. But for now, they remain where they fell, a soft carpet that muffles footsteps and absorbs sound. The joiner himself stands at his bench. He is a man of perhaps 40 years, though it is difficult to tell. His face is weathered from years of work, lined around the eyes and mouth, but his hands are steady. His hands are everything. They are broad and strong, with thick fingers and calluses on the palms where the tools press. His nails are short, trimmed with a knife, and there is always a fine dust of sawdust embedded in the creases of his knuckles. He wears a leather apron, stained dark with oil and wax, and a simple wool tunic beneath. His sleeves are rolled to the elbows. Before him on the bench lies a board. It is oak, as everything here is oak, but this is no ordinary board. This is quarter-sawn oak, and if you understand what that means, you understand everything about why the joiner does what he does the way he does it. Let us talk about the tree. When an oak tree is felled, when it crashes to the forest floor and lies there like a fallen giant, it is not yet wood. It is still a tree, still holding the memory of wind and rain and seasons. The sawyers come with their pit saw, that great two-handled blade, and they begin the work of conversion. One man stands on top of the log, one man below in the pit, and together they pull the saw up and down, transforming the round trunk into square timbers and flat boards. This is brutal work. It is sweaty work. It is work that fills the lungs with dust and makes the arms burn. But how you cut the tree matters. It matters profoundly. If you simply slice through the log, making cuts parallel to one side, you get what is called plain-sawn lumber. These boards are easy to produce, and you can get many of them from a single log, but they have a problem. They cup. They warp. They twist as they dry because the growth rings, those concentric circles that mark each year of the tree's life, run at an angle across the face of the board. As the wood dries, as the moisture leaves the cells, the growth rings try to straighten out, and the board bends. But if you cut the log differently, if you first split it down the middle, and then make your cuts radiating out from the center like spokes on a wheel, you get quarter-sawn lumber. With quarter-sawn lumber, the growth rings run perpendicular to the face of the board, straight up and down like the bars of a cage. These boards are more difficult to produce. You get fewer of them from each log, but they are stable. They do not cup. They do not warp. They are the boards a joiner wants, the boards a joiner needs, because when you are building furniture that must last for generations, stability is everything. The board on the bench is such a board. It is perhaps 3 feet long, 8 inches wide, and 1 inch thick. The growth rings run straight through its thickness, visible on the end grain like the lines of a musical staff. The face of the board shows the medullary rays, those radial tissues that run from the center of the tree outward. In oak, these rays are prominent, and when quarter-sawn, they create a distinctive figure on the wood's surface, a pattern of flecks and flashes that catch the light. The joiners call this figure. The poets might call it beauty. The joiner runs his hand across the surface of the board. He is reading it. His fingers move slowly, feeling for high spots and low spots, sensing the subtle topography that his eyes alone might miss. Wood is not flat, not truly. Even a board that has been sawn at the pit will have irregularities, waves and hollows created by the way the saw blade flexed as it cut, by the way the sawyers tired and their strokes became uneven. Before this board can be used, before it can be joined to another board to create a chest or a panel or a door, it must be made flat. It must be made true. This is where the plane comes in. The joiner reaches for his triplane, and even the act of picking it up is deliberate, careful. The triplane is a tool of considerable size and weight. It is perhaps 18 inches long, made entirely of wood save for the iron blade that protrudes from the sole. The body is beech, that pale, fine-grained wood that is hard enough to resist wear, but not so hard that it becomes brittle. The surface of the plane has been smoothed by years of use, darkened by the oil from countless hands, and it fits into the joiner's grip as naturally as if it had grown there. He checks the blade. This is automatic, instinctive. He turns the plane over and sights along the sole, looking to see how far the blade projects. It should project only slightly, just the thickness of a hair. Too little, and it will not cut. Too much, and it will chatter and dig, leaving gouges in the wood. The joiner made this plane himself, years ago when he was still an apprentice under Master Thomas. He fitted the wedge that holds the blade in place, planed the sole until it was perfectly flat, and shaped the handle to fit his own hand. It is as much a part of him now as his fingers. He positions the board on the bench. The bench itself is a masterpiece, though the joiner would never call it that. It is a massive slab of oak, perhaps 8 feet long and 2 feet wide, supported by a sturdy frame with legs as thick as a man's thigh. On the left end of the bench is a bench hook, a simple wooden stop that the board can be pushed against to prevent it from sliding. The surface of the bench is parked with small holes and dents, the accumulated history of years of work, but it is flat. It must be flat. A joiner's bench is his reference surface, the plane from which all measurements are taken. He places the board against the bench hook and stands at the left end, the plane in both hands. His left hand grips the front handle, called a tote, while his right hand rests on the rear handle. His stance is wide, feet planted firmly on the floor. His weight is balanced, ready to shift forward as he pushes. The first stroke is exploratory. He places the plane on the board, tilts it slightly to engage the blade, and pushes. The plane moves forward, and there is resistance, that slight friction as the blade bites into the wood. Then the shaving begins to form, curling up through the mouth of the plane, and there is sound. Shhh. It is a whisper, a long, drawn-out sigh. Wisp. The shaving emerges from the plane like a ribbon, curling over on itself, translucent at the edges where it is thinnest. He examines the shaving. It is thick on one side, thin on the other. This tells him the board is not flat, that one edge is higher than the other. He adjusts his stance, puts more pressure on the high side, and takes another stroke. Shhh. Wisp. Another shaving curls away, and another, and another. This is where the meditation begins. This is where time slows and the world contracts to just this, just the board and the plane and the rhythm of the stroke. Push forward, feel the blade cut, hear the whisper, watch the shaving curl. Bring the plane back, position it, push again. The rhythm is steady like a heartbeat, like breathing. Shhh, wisp, shhh, wisp. The joiner's mind empties of everything else. There is no thought of the chest he is building, no thought of the customer who has commissioned it, no thought of the rent due to the guild or the grain that must be bought for winter. There is only this, the physical act of making a rough surface smooth, of imposing order on chaos. His body knows this rhythm. His muscles know when to push and when to relax. His arms extend forward, his weight shifts onto his front foot, and the plane glides across the board. At the end of the stroke, he lifts slightly to prevent the blade from digging in at the edge. Then he brings the plane back, sets it down a fraction of an inch over from the previous stroke, and pushes again. Gradually, stroke by stroke, he works his way across the width of the board. The shavings accumulate. They pile up in soft mounds on the bench, they drift down to the floor, they catch in the folds of his apron. Each shaving is a record of this moment, a physical manifestation of the transformation happening under his hands. If you were to look closely at a shaving, you would see the structure of the wood itself, the cellular pattern, the way the fibers have been cleanly severed by the blade. This is sharp work. The blade is sharp enough to shave the hair from your arm, sharp enough to cut paper with a touch. The joiner sharpens it himself, every morning before work begins, using a whetstone kept wet with water from the bucket in the corner. After perhaps 20 strokes, he stops and checks his progress. He sets the plane aside and runs his fingers across the surface of the board again. It is smoother now, but still not flat. He can feel a slight crown in the middle, a high spot that must be removed. He picks up the plane and continues, but now he concentrates his strokes on the center of the board, taking a shaving here, a shaving there, selectively removing wood from the high areas. This is the art of it. Anyone can push a plane across a board. An apprentice can do that on his first day. But to make a board truly flat, to bring it into perfect alignment with the ideal plane that exists in the joiner's mind, that takes skill. That takes feel. You must read the wood, understand how it wants to move, know where to remove material and where to leave it. You must trust your hands more than your eyes, because hands do not lie. Hands feel the truth. The light from the window shifts as the sun moves lower. The golden color deepens to amber, then to a rich orange that makes the shavings on the floor glow like embers. The joiner does not notice. He is lost in the work, lost in the rhythm, lost in that timeless space where the craftsman and the craft become one thing. Shhh, wisp, shhh, wisp. The sound is almost musical, each stroke a note in a long, slow melody. The plane's blade sings as it cuts. The shaving whispers as it curls. Even the scrape of the plane's sole against the wood has its own voice, a deeper sound, grittier, that underlies the higher whisper of the blade. He works until his arms begin to tire, until the first ache appears in his shoulders. Then he stops and checks the board again. He picks it up and looks along its length, sighting down the edge like an archer sighting down an arrow. The edge is straight now. No bows, no curves, just a clean, straight line. He turns it 90 degrees and sights along the width, also straight. He sets it back on the bench and places a long, straight edge across its surface, a piece of steel that he bought from a tool merchant in London 10 years ago. The straight edge is perfectly straight, made by a smith who specialized in such things, and it is the joiner's most precious possession. The straight edge touches the wood at both ends, and there is no light showing underneath. The board is flat. It is true. He nods once, satisfied, and sets the triplane aside. But flat is only the beginning. The board must also be smooth. The triplane leaves a surface that is textured, marked with tiny ridges from each pass of the blade. For some purposes, this is sufficient. But for fine work, for furniture that will be waxed and polished, the surface must be refined further. The joiner reaches for his smoothing plane. This is a smaller tool, perhaps 9 inches long, with a blade set at a different angle. Where the tri-plane's blade cuts at 45 degrees, the smoothing plane's blade is pitched at 50 degrees or even higher. This steeper angle is better for cutting difficult grain, for wood that wants to tear instead of slice. The joiner adjusts the blade until it protrudes just barely, less than the thickness of a hair, and then he begins again. The strokes with the smoothing plane are different. They are shorter, more controlled. The joiner stands closer to the work, leaning over it, watching the surface as he planes. Each stroke removes a shaving so thin it is almost transparent, like a curl of soap or a petal from a flower. The sound is different too, softer, more subtle. Instead of shhh-wisp, it is more like shhhhhhh, a continuous whisper with no break between the beginning and the end. He works systematically, starting at one end of the board and moving toward the other, overlapping each stroke slightly. The surface begins to change. Where before it was matte and slightly rough, now it begins to develop a subtle sheen. The figure in the wood becomes more visible, the medullary rays catching the light and reflecting it back. The grain pattern emerges like a photograph developing in a chemical bath, slowly revealing its hidden complexity. This is what the joiner loves. This moment when the wood reveals itself, when all the planning and sawing and planing come together, and the beauty that was locked inside the tree becomes visible. Every board is different. Every board has its own character, its own story written in the patterns of its grain. This board, this particular piece of quarter-sawn oak, has a gentle, regular figure, the rays evenly spaced and running parallel. It will make a beautiful panel, he thinks. It will look good paired with its neighbor. He finishes the smoothing and sets the plane aside. The board now has a surface like silk. When he runs his hand across it, there is no resistance, no friction, just the smooth glide of skin on wood. He brings his nose close and inhales. The scent is stronger now, released by the fresh cuts, the aroma of oak that smells like the forest floor, like fallen leaves and earth and time. But we are not done. The board is flat and smooth, but it is still just a board. To become furniture, to become part of a chest or a cabinet, it must be joined to other boards. And this is where the real craft begins. This is where the joiner earns his name. The chest he is building will have 4 sides and a bottom. Each corner where 2 sides meet must be joined, locked together in a way that will hold for decades, for centuries. In the blacksmith's world, this would be done with nails or rivets, with metal driven through wood. But the joiner does not use nails. Nails rust. Nails split the wood. Nails are the crude solution of someone who does not understand the material. The joiner uses geometry. He uses friction. He uses the wood itself to lock the wood together. He will cut dovetails. The word itself is descriptive. A dovetail is shaped like the tail of a dove, that small grey bird that coos in the eaves of the church. The joint consists of a series of interlocking pins and tails, cut with such precision that they can only fit together one way, but when they do, they lock so tightly that no force can pull them apart. The geometry is simple but elegant. The tails are wider at one end than the other, creating a trapezoidal shape. The pins are the negative space between the tails, cut to match exactly. When you slide the tails into the pins, the angled sides wedge together, and friction holds them fast. But to create this joint, every cut must be perfect. If a tail is too wide, it will not fit. If it is too narrow, it will be loose. If the angle is wrong, the joint will rack and twist. There is no room for error. No filler, no glue can hide a mistake. The joint either fits or it does not. The joiner begins the layout. He takes a second board, the one that will form the adjacent side of the chest, and places it next to the first. He measures the thickness of the first board with a pair of dividers, those elegant compasses with 2 sharp points. He sets the dividers to span the thickness exactly, then transfers that measurement to the end of the second board, scratching a fine line across the grain with one of the points. This line is called the baseline, and it marks where the tails will terminate. where they will meet the surface of the adjoining board. Next comes the bevel gauge. This is a simple tool, just two pieces of wood joined by a brass pivot that allows them to swivel to any angle. The joiner sets the angle to 1 in 6, the traditional slope for dovetails in oak. 1 in 6 means that for every 6 units the tail travels vertically, it slopes inward by 1 unit horizontally. This creates an angle of approximately 9.5 degrees from vertical, steep enough to create a mechanical lark, but not so steep that the short grain at the narrow end of the tail becomes weak and prone to breaking. He holds the bevel gauge against the end of the board and uses it to guide his marking knife. The knife is small, about the size of a pen, with a blade ground to a single bevel like a tiny chisel. He draws the knife along the edge of the bevel gauge, cutting a fine line into the wood. The knife does not mark like a pencil. It cuts the fibers, creating a groove that is simultaneously a visual guide and a physical barrier that will help prevent tear-out when the saw reaches it. He spaces the tails evenly across the width of the board. For a board 8 inches wide, he will cut 5 tails with a pin between each 1.5 pin at each edge. The spacing is not random, but carefully calculated. The tails should be wide enough to have strength, but narrow enough to look delicate. The pins should be substantial enough to resist breaking, but not so wide that they dominate the appearance of the joint. This is a balance, a negotiation between strength and beauty. He marks each tail carefully, using the bevel gauge to ensure every angle is consistent. The knife whispers against the wood as it cuts, leaving behind crisp, clean lines. When the layout is complete, he steps back and examines his work. The pattern of lines looks like a musical score, rhythmic and regular. Each tail is marked with an X in the waist area, the wood that will be removed. This seems like an unnecessary step, like something an apprentice would need but a master would not. But the joiner marks them anyway. It is part of the ritual, part of the careful progression from blank wood to finished joint. Now comes the saw. The joiner selects his dovetail saw from the rack on the wall. This is a specialized tool, different from the great crosscut saw used to fell trees or the pit saw used to convert logs into boards. The dovetail saw is small and delicate, perhaps 10 inches long, with a thin blade that is stiffened by a brass or steel spine along its back. This back, gives the saw its name, back saw. The blade itself is perhaps 2/1000 of an inch thick, barely thicker than a heavy paper, and it is tensioned in the spine so it stays straight during the cut. The teeth of the saw are tiny, perhaps 15 or even 20 per inch, and they are filed in a rip pattern. Rip teeth cut along the grain, severing the wood fibers like tiny chisels. Each tooth is a miniature blade, sharpened to a chisel edge that scrapes away the wood rather than slicing through it. When cutting across the grain, you would use crosscut teeth, which are filed to points that slice the fibers cleanly. But dovetails are cut with the grain, so rip teeth are what you need. The joiner tests the saw's sharpness by drawing it lightly across his thumbnail. The teeth catch and bite without sliding. It is sharp. He sharpened it himself 2 days ago, using a triangular file to dress each tooth, ensuring they are all the same height and angle. This is meditative work, sitting at the bench with the saw clamped in a wooden vise, drawing the file across each tooth in turn, counting the strokes to ensure consistency. 3 strokes per tooth, no more, no less. He positions the board in his vise. The vise is a simple mechanism, just 2 thick boards connected by a screw that can be tightened to clamp work between them. The joiner's vise is built into his bench, the rear board fixed to the bench leg, and the front board movable. He places the board vertically in the vise with the end grain facing up and tightens the screw until the board is held firmly. Then he picks up the saw. He grips the handle lightly, like shaking hands with a friend, his index finger extended along the side of the handle to guide the blade. This is important. The finger points where the saw will cut. If the finger is straight, the saw will be straight. If the finger deviates, the saw will follow. He places the saw teeth on the far corner of the board, on one of the lines he marked with his knife. The saw rests at an angle, perhaps 30 degrees from vertical, tilted away from him. He draws the saw back gently, just one or two teeth touching the wood, and the saw begins to cut. It takes just a few strokes to establish a kerf, a groove that will guide the saw for the rest of the cut. Once the kerf is established, he changes his angle. The saw comes up to 45 degrees, halfway between horizontal and vertical, and he begins to saw in earnest. The motion is rhythmic but not forced. He lets the weight of the saw do the work, pulling on the backstroke and pushing lightly on the forward stroke. The teeth cut only on the push stroke, so the pull is just to reposition the blade. The sound is distinctive. It is not the harsh rasp of a coarse or cutting green wood. It is gentler, a soft shish-shish-shish, like the sound of waves on a distant shore. The saw moves smoothly through the oak, the teeth severing the fibers one by one, the kerf widening as the blade descends. Sawdust falls from the cut in a fine stream, accumulating in a small pile on the bench below. The joiner watches the line. He must stay on the waist side of the line, cutting away the wood that is marked with an X while leaving the line itself intact. The line is the boundary, the definition of the tail, and if he cuts into it, the tail will be too narrow. The joint will be loose. It will fail. So he watches carefully, adjusting his angle minutely to keep the saw tracking true. He cuts down to the baseline, the horizontal line that marks the bottom of the tails. When the saw reaches this line, he stops. He does not cut through it. Not yet. First, he must cut all the tails to the same depth, then he will remove the waste between them. He moves to the next line and repeats the process. Position the saw, establish the kerf, saw down to the baseline. Shish, shish, shish. The rhythm is soothing, almost hypnotic. Each cut is identical to the one before, the same angle, the same pressure, the same careful attention to staying on the waist side of the line. This is precision work. This is the work that separates the joiner from the carpenter, the craftsman from the laborer. The light continues to shift. The orange of late afternoon deepens to the red gold of approaching sunset. Shadows lengthen across the workshop floor, and the contrast between light and dark becomes more pronounced. The joiner does not light a candle. He will work as long as the daylight lasts, and when it is gone, he will stop. There is no point in rushing. The chest will be finished when it is finished, and not before. He completes all the cuts on one side of the tails, then rotates the board in the vise and cuts the other side. Each tail is now defined by two angled cuts that meet at the baseline. Between the tails are the waste areas, the wood that must be removed to create the spaces where the pins will fit. Removing the waste is delicate work. The joiner cannot simply saw straight across because that would cut into the baseline, creating a rough surface that would prevent the joint from seating properly. Instead, he must chisel away the waste, working carefully from both sides toward the middle. He selects a chisel from his rack. This one is perhaps half an inch wide, with a blade that has been ground and honed until it is sharp enough to pare the hair from your arm. The handle is worn smooth from years of use, darkened by the oil from his hands. He places the board flat on the bench and positions the chisel in the waist area, the bevel facing down toward the wood. Then, with a mallet made of a dense wood called lignum vitae, he strikes the chisel smartly. Tap. The chisel bites into the wood, cutting down perhaps an eighth of an inch. He repositions the chisel slightly deeper and strikes again. Tap. Another chip flies away. He works methodically, chopping down to about halfway through the board, then he flips the board over and works from the other side. The chips that fly away are small and triangular, each one revealing a fresh, pale surface of oak that has not seen light for perhaps 100 years, since the tree was still growing. When the waste is removed, the spaces between the tails are clean and flat. The joiner runs his finger along the baseline, feeling for any roughness or irregularities. There are none. The surface is smooth and even exactly where it should be. The tails stand proud like the battlements of a castle, evenly spaced and precisely angled. Now comes the most critical step. He must transfer the pattern of the tails to the mating board, creating the pins that will interlock with them. This is done through a process called direct marking. He takes the board with the tails and positions it exactly where it will be in the finished chest, holding it vertically against the end of the other board. Then he takes his marking knife and reaches between the tails, drawing the knife along each surface to scribe a line onto the pin board below. This is where precision becomes paramount. The knife must follow the surface of the tail exactly, tracing its angle without deviation. If the knife wanders, if it cuts a line that does not perfectly match the tail, the joint will not fit. The joiner's hand is steady. He has done this 1,000 times, perhaps 10,000 times. The knife moves smoothly, confidently, leaving behind crisp lines that mark exactly where the pins must be cut. He removes the tail board and examines the pin board. The pattern of lines looks like the negative image of the tails, a mirror reflection. He marks the waist areas with an X, just as he did before, then positions the board in his vise and picks up his dovetail saw once more. The cutting of the pins is identical to the cutting of the tails. Same saw, same angle, same careful attention to staying on the waist side of the line. Shish, shish, shish. The saw whispers through the oak, creating curves that will define the pins. The joiner's mind is empty now, completely absorbed in the work. There is no past, no future, only this moment, this cut, this precise movement of steel through wood. Outside, the sun has set. The sky visible through the small window is deep purple, fading to black. The workshop is filled with shadows, but there is still enough light to see by, that last lingering twilight that comes after sunset. The joiner completes the saw cuts, then reaches for his chisel to remove the waste between the pins. Tap, tap, tap. The mallet strikes the chisel and chips fly. The joiner works from both sides, chopping down to the baseline, removing the waste that stands between him and a completed joint. His movements are efficient, practiced, economical. No wasted motion, no hesitation. Just the steady, rhythmic progress of skilled hands performing familiar work. When the waste is cleared, when the pins stand proud just as the tails did before them, the joiner pauses. This is the moment. This is when he will discover if all his careful work has been successful or if somewhere, somehow, an error has crept in. He picks up the tail board and positions it over the pin board, aligning the parts carefully. Then, slowly, he presses down. The joint should fit with hand pressure alone, no mallet needed, but it should not be loose. There should be resistance, friction, the feeling of wood sliding past wood with just enough force to hold, but not so much that something might break. The joiner presses, and the tails begin to enter the pins. He feels the resistance. He presses harder. The joint slides together. Slowly, steadily, the two boards merge into one. The tails disappear into the pins, the surfaces come flush, and then, with a final push, the joint is home. The joiner rocks the assembly gently, testing for movement. There is none. The joint is tight. It is solid. It is locked together by nothing more than geometry and friction, by the precise cutting of angled surfaces that wedge together and refuse to be parted. In the dimming light, the joiner allows himself a small smile. The joint is good. The work is good. Tomorrow he will cut the remaining corners, join all four sides together, fit the bottom panel, and begin the process of smoothing and finishing. But for now, for this moment, he has achieved what he set out to achieve. He has taken two separate pieces of wood and united them into something stronger than either piece alone. He sets the assembly aside and begins to clean his tools. The saw goes back on its rack. The chisels are wiped clean of sawdust and returned to their designated places. The plane irons are checked one final time, then the planes are set carefully on the shelf, soles down. The shavings on the bench are swept into a basket. The floor is cleared. As he works, the apprentice arrives to light the candles and begin closing the shop for the night. The boy is perhaps 12 years old, thin and quiet, and he moves around the workshop with the careful respect of someone who knows his place. He lights the tallow candles one by one, and their flickering yellow light pushes back the darkness, creating shadows that dance on the walls. The joiner washes his hands in the bucket of water, drying them on a rag that hangs from a nail. His hands are tired, the muscles aching slightly from the day's work, but it is a good ache, the ache of productive labor. He looks around the workshop one final time, checking that everything is in its place, that all the tools are properly stored, that the work is secure. The chest in progress sits on the bench, the dovetailed corner visible in the candlelight. The joint is beautiful, the mechanical perfection of it, the way the tails and pins interlock so precisely. Tomorrow, more joints. Tomorrow, more cutting and fitting and careful work. But tonight, the day's task is done. The joiner removes his apron and hangs it on its peg. He nods to the apprentice, who will remain for a few more minutes to ensure the candles are safely positioned and the door is properly barred. Then he steps out into the night, leaving behind the smell of oak and beeswax, leaving behind the quiet workshop with its tools and wood and accumulated history. The street outside is dark, lit only by the moon and stars. The cobblestones are uneven beneath his feet. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barks. The air is cool and carries the scent of wood smoke from the many chimneys of the town. The joiner pulls his cloak around his shoulders and begins the short walk home. His mind is already moving ahead, planning tomorrow's work. He will need to cut 3 more corners, each one requiring the same careful layout and precise sawing. Then the bottom panel must be fitted, grooves cut in the sides to receive it. The lid must be made, with its own joinery and perhaps some carving if the customer wishes it. There is much work still to do. But for now, in this moment between the workshop and home, the joiner walks through the darkened streets and thinks about dovetails, about the way the angled cuts create a mechanical lark that will hold for centuries, about the way the grain of the oak runs through the joint, creating continuity between the parts, about the satisfaction of fitting 2 pieces together and feeling them lock into place with that final, decisive push. This is his craft. This is what he does. He does not build with nails or glue or metal fasteners. He builds with geometry and precision and an understanding of wood that goes beyond mere knowledge to become something deeper, something almost intuitive. He reads the grain, feels the figure, knows how the wood will move and what it needs to remain stable. And tomorrow he will return to the workshop, sharpen his tools, and continue the work. The chest will grow piece by piece, joint by joint, until it is complete. And when it is delivered to the customer, when it takes its place in their home, it will serve them for their lifetime and their children's lifetimes, and perhaps beyond. It will hold their possessions, protect their valuables, stand as a testament to skilled workmanship and careful craft. This is why the joiner does what he does, not for wealth or fame or recognition, but for the simple satisfaction of making something well, of taking raw material and transforming it into an object of beauty and utility. Every dovetail is a small victory. Every smooth surface is an achievement. Every completed piece is a legacy. The joiner reaches his home, a modest timber-framed house not far from the workshop. His wife has kept a fire burning in the hearth, and there is soup waiting and bread. He sits at the table and eats, answering his wife's questions about the day's work, telling her about the dovetails and how well they fit. After the meal, he sits by the fire for a while, warming his hands, feeling the heat penetrate the aches and stiffness. His eyes grow heavy. The day has been long, filled with focused work and physical effort. It is time for rest. He climbs the ladder to the sleeping loft, where a simple bed waits. The mattress is stuffed with straw, and the blankets are wool, scratchy but warm. He lies down and closes his eyes, and immediately the images of the day's work begin to flow through his mind. The plane cutting its whispered shavings, the saw tracking down the waist side of the line, the chisel chopping away the excess, the final satisfaction of the joint sliding home. These images slowly fade as sleep approaches. The joiner's breathing deepens and slows. His body relaxes, releasing the tension held in muscles and joints. And as he drifts into sleep, his hands, those broad, capable hands with their calluses and embedded sawdust, twitch slightly, rehearsing in dreams the movements they have performed in waking, preparing for tomorrow when the work will begin again. In the workshop, the candles burn down. The apprentice checks them one final time, ensuring none are near anything flammable, then bars the door and departs for his own home. The workshop settles into darkness and silence. The shavings on the floor rustle slightly as a draft finds its way through the cracks in the walls. The tools on their racks gleam faintly in the moonlight that filters through the small window. And the chest, the partially completed chest with its single perfect dovetailed corner, waits patiently on the bench. The oak is stable, dry, quarter-sawn, so it will not warp or twist. The joint is tight, locked together by geometry and friction, by the precise work of skilled hands guided by years of experience. Tomorrow there will be more joints, more careful work, more transformation of raw wood into finished object. But tonight, in the darkness, the wood simply exists. The grain runs through it, those growth rings that mark the years of the tree's life, those medullary rays that create the figure on the surface. The cells that once carried water and nutrients from roots to leaves now stand empty and dry, their structure preserved, their arrangement creating the strength and beauty that make oak the joiner's material of choice. If you could see the joint at a microscopic level, you would see how the fibers of the two boards intermingle at the surfaces where they touch, how the friction between them creates the bond. You would see the precision of the cuts, the way the surfaces mate perfectly with no gaps or irregularities. You would see the grain running across the joint, creating continuity, making the two boards into one. But you cannot see these things with the naked eye. You can only see the result, the way the corner of the chest stands strong and square, the way the dovetails create their distinctive pattern, wider at one end than the other, interlocking like fingers clasped in prayer. This is the joiner's art. This is the legacy of generations of craftsmen who have refined the technique, improved the tools, developed the understanding of wood and its properties. Each generation learns from the one before, adding their own insights and innovations, passing the knowledge forward to the apprentices who will become the masters of tomorrow. And so it continues, this ancient craft, this transformation of tree into object, this marriage of skill and material. In workshops across England, across Europe, across the world, wherever there are trees and people who work with wood, the same tools are being used, the same techniques applied. Planes whisper across surfaces, saws track down carefully marked lines, chisels chop away waste, hands feel for flatness and smoothness and truth. The work is slow. It cannot be rushed. Good joinery takes time, takes patience, takes the willingness to do each step carefully and correctly, knowing that any shortcut, any compromise will manifest as weakness in the final product. The joiner who hurries, who cuts carelessly or marks imprecisely, will produce work that fails. The joint will be loose, the chest will rack and twist, and the customer will be unsatisfied. But the joiner who works with care, who respects the material and the tools and the techniques, will produce work that endures. Centuries from now, long after the joiner's name is forgotten, the chest will remain. It will be passed from generation to generation, growing dark with age, developing the patina that comes from years of handling and use. And if someone examines it closely, if they look at the dovetails in the corners, they will see the precision of the cuts, the tightness of the fit, the evidence of skilled hands guided by a practiced eye. This is immortality of a sort, not the immortality of the poet or the painter whose names are remembered and celebrated, but the quiet immortality of the craftsman whose work speaks for itself, whose skill is evident in every joint and surface, whose legacy is measured not in words or images, but in objects that serve and endure. The moon continues its arc across the sky. The stars wheel overhead in their ancient patterns. The town sleeps, its inhabitants resting in preparation for tomorrow's labor. And in the joiner's workshop, the chest waits, patient and silent, slowly accumulating the character that comes from being made by hand, from being the product of human skill and care and attention. Tomorrow, the work continues. More joints to cut, more surfaces to smooth, more pieces to fit together. Each step building on the one before, each piece contributing to the whole, until finally the chest is complete and ready to begin its long life of service. But that is tomorrow. Tonight there is only rest and darkness and the quiet satisfaction of work well done. The joiner sleeps, his hands still, his mind at peace. And in the workshop, the wood waits, holding within it the promise of what it will become, the potential that will be realized through patient, skilled labor. The grain runs through it. The figure catches what little light penetrates the darkness. And the dovetails, those precise interlocking joints, stand as testament to the joiner's art, to the marriage of geometry and craft, to the transformation of separate pieces into unified whole. This is the medieval joiner's world, a world of oak and beeswax, of planes and saws and chisels, a world where time is measured in shavings and saw strokes, where progress is made incrementally through patient, careful work, a world where the reward is not wealth or fame, but the simple satisfaction of making something well, of creating an object that will serve its purpose and endure beyond its maker's lifetime. And tomorrow, when the sun rises and light once again fills the workshop, the joiner will return. He will sharpen his tools, check his measurements, and continue the work. The triplane will whisper across wood. The dovetail saw will track down marked lines. The chisel will chop away waste. And slowly, patiently, the chest will take shape, growing from idea to reality through the application of skill and knowledge. And the workshop door opens, and morning light spills across the floor, cutting through the darkness like a blade. The joiner enters, his breath visible in the cold air, and he pauses for a moment to let his eyes adjust. The chest waits on the bench where he left it, the single dovetailed corner standing proud in the pale dawn light. He can see the joint from where he stands, and even from this distance, he can tell it is good. The tails and pins interlock perfectly, creating that distinctive pattern that marks the work of a skilled craftsman. But good is not the same as perfect. The joiner crosses to the bench and examines the joint more closely. He runs his finger along the edge where the two boards meet, feeling for any unevenness, any slight projection where one surface stands higher than the other. There, just at the end of one tail, he feels a tiny ridge, barely perceptible, perhaps no more than the thickness of a single wood fiber. To most people, this would be invisible, inconsequential. But to the joiner, it is a flaw that must be corrected. He reaches for his chisel, not the heavy mortise chisel used for chopping away waste, but a paring chisel. This is a more delicate tool, with a blade perhaps an inch wide and very long, giving it flexibility. The blade is ground to a near-perfect flatness on the back, with the bevel on the front polished like a mirror. The edge is so sharp that if you look at it under magnification, you would see no ragged fibers or torn metal, just a clean intersection of two planes meeting at an angle so acute it seems impossible. The joiner does not use a mallet for paring. This work requires control, finesse, the ability to remove wood in shavings so thin they are almost invisible. He holds the chisel in both hands, the handle braced against his shoulder, the blade angled slightly downward to engage the wood. Then he leans forward, using the weight and strength of his body to drive the chisel through the oak. The chisel moves forward, and a shaving curls away from the edge. It is translucent, so thin that when held up to the light, you can see through it. The thickness of this shaving might be 2 or 3 thousandths of an inch, barely enough to measure. But it is enough. The joiner makes another pass, removing another whisper-thin shaving. then another. Each stroke is controlled, deliberate, removing only what is necessary and nothing more. Tark. The sound of the chisel meeting the wood is soft, almost musical. Not the sharp crack of a mallet strike, but a gentler sound, like a knuckle tapping on a door. Tark. Another shaving falls away. Tark. The joiner works patiently, checking his progress after every few strokes by running his finger across the joint. The ridge is getting smaller. Tark. Smaller still. Tark. And then it is gone. The joint is flush. He sets the chisel aside and examines the corner again. The two boards meet in a perfect plane, no step, no gap, no irregularity. When he sights along the edge, the line is straight and true. When he presses his fingernail into the joint, trying to catch it on any imperfection, he feels nothing. The joint has disappeared. It has become invisible, which is the highest achievement of joinery. The goal is not to showcase the joint, but to make it vanish, to make two boards into one continuous surface. But this is only one corner. The chest has four corners, and each one requires the same careful work. The joiner moves to the next corner, where he has already cut the tails, but not yet cut the mating pins. He takes up the tail board and positions it against the pin board, preparing to scribe the pattern. His marking knife appears in his hand, and he begins to trace the outline of each tail onto the wood below. The knife moves steadily, following the surface of the tails without deviation. The blade is sharp enough to cut the oak fibers cleanly, leaving a crisp line that will guide the saw. The joiner's hand is sure. He has done this so many times that the movement has become automatic, inscribed in his muscles and nerves so deeply that he could probably do it in darkness, by touch alone. When the marking is complete, he positions the board in his vise and reaches for his dovetail saw. The familiar weight of the tool settles into his hand, the handle smooth and comfortable. He places the saw teeth on the line, draws back to establish the kerf, and then begins to cut. Shish, shish, shish. The sound is rhythmic, meditative, the same sound that filled the workshop yesterday and will fill it again tomorrow. The saw tracks down the line, staying carefully on the waste side, removing wood in a fine stream of sawdust that falls to the bench below. Cut follows cut. The joiner works his way across the board, sawing down each line to the baseline. His posture is relaxed but focused. His breathing is steady. There is no tension in his shoulders, no strain in his arms. The saw does the work. He merely guides it, keeping it on track, maintaining the correct angle. When all the cuts are made, he removes the board from the vise and lays it flat on the bench. Now comes the chopping, the removal of the waste between the pins. He positions his chisel in the waste area and reaches for his mallet. The mallet is made of lignum vitae, a wood so dense it almost feels like stone. When it strikes the chisel, the sound is solid and satisfying. Tap. The chisel bites into the oak, cutting down perhaps an eighth of an inch. Tap. Another chip flies away, revealing fresh wood beneath. Tap. The joiner works methodically, chopping from both sides toward the middle, removing the waste in stages. The chips that accumulate on the bench are small and irregular, each one a tiny piece of the negative space that will receive the tails. This work requires judgment. Chop too deeply, and you risk cutting below the baseline, creating a gap when the joint is assembled. Chop too shallowly, and waste will remain, preventing the joint from seating properly. The joiner has learned through years of practice to remove the waste to within a hair of the baseline, leaving just enough wood that the final pairing with the chisel will bring the surface perfectly flush. When the chopping is complete, he switches back to his paring chisel. This is the critical phase, the final refinement that will determine whether the joint fits properly. He places the chisel flat on the bottom of the waste area, the back of the blade riding on the wood, and pushes forward. A thin shaving curls away, revealing the baseline. He works carefully, checking frequently, ensuring that the surface is flat and even across its entire width. The light from the window has strengthened as the sun rises higher. The workshop is warming slightly. though it is still cold enough that the joiner can see his breath when he exhales. He pays no attention to the temperature. His focus is entirely on the work before him, on the precise removal of wood, on the creation of surfaces that will mate together with perfect accuracy. When the pins are complete, when the waste has been removed and the surfaces paired flat, the moment arrives, the moment of truth. The joiner picks up the tail board and positions it above the pin board, aligning them carefully. This is the test. This is when he will discover if all his careful layout and cutting has produced the result he intended. He begins to press the boards together. The tails enter the pins, and immediately he feels resistance. This is good. There should be resistance. If the joint slides together easily without any friction, it means the cuts are too loose. The joint will rattle. It will be weak. But if there is too much resistance, if the joint refuses to go together, that means the cuts are too tight. Something will break. The resistance he feels now is just right. It is firm but not excessive. He presses harder, using the heel of his hand to drive the joint home. The tails slide deeper into the pins. The two boards come closer together. And then, with a final push, the joint seats completely. Thunk. The sound is satisfying, definitive, the sound of wood meeting wood with nothing between them but friction and precision. The joiner rocks the assembly gently, testing for any movement. There is none. The joint is solid. He tries to pull the boards apart. They resist, locked together by the geometry of the dovetails. To separate them, he would need to drive them apart with a mallet, and even then it would require considerable force. Once assembled, dovetail joints do not want to come apart. He examines the outer surface where the two boards meet. The joint line is barely visible, just a thin shadow where the end grain of one board meets the face grain of the other. When the chest is finished, when it has been smoothed and waxed, this line will be even less apparent. The chest will appear to be made from continuous pieces of wood, the joints invisible to casual inspection. Satisfied, he sets this corner aside and moves to the next. The pattern repeats. Mark the pins, cut them with the dovetail saw, chop away the waste, pair the surfaces flat, test the fit. Each corner is slightly different because wood is a natural material and no two pieces are exactly alike. The grain varies, the density changes, subtle differences in moisture content affect how the wood cuts. But the joiner adjusts for these variations automatically, adapting his technique to the specific characteristics of each piece. By midday, all four corners are cut and fitted. The chest can now be assembled. The joiner lays out the pieces on his bench, arranging them in the order they will be joined. Front, back, two sides, and the bottom panel. The bottom panel is different from the sides. It is thinner, perhaps half an inch thick instead of the full inch of the sides, and it will not be dovetailed. Instead, it will float in grooves cut into the inside faces of the four sides. The grooves are cut with a specialized plane called a plow plane. This tool has a narrow blade, perhaps a quarter-inch wide, that projects from the sole like a tiny fence. The plane is guided along the inside face of the board, cutting a groove of consistent depth and width. The joiner sets the fence on the plow plane to position the groove about half an inch up from the bottom edge of the board, then makes pass after pass, each one deepening the groove slightly until it reaches the required depth of perhaps 3/8 of an inch. The sound of the plow plane is different from the tri-plane or the smoothing plane. It is higher pitched, almost a squeak, as the narrow blade cuts through the oak. Ee. The shavings that emerge are long and narrow, like ribbons. They curl out of the mouth of the plane and fall to the bench, adding to the accumulation of shavings that carpets the floor. When all four sides have their grooves cut, the joiner tests the bottom panel. He slides it into the groove on one side, checking that it fits properly. The fit should not be tight. The panel needs room to expand and contract with changes in humidity. In summer, when the air is moist, the panel will swell. In winter, when the air is dry, it will shrink. If the panel is trapped tightly in the grooves, it will split as it tries to move. But if it is allowed to float freely, it can expand and contract without damage. The panel slides smoothly into the groove, with perhaps a 16th of an inch of clearance on each side. Perfect. The joiner sets it aside and prepares for final assembly. But before the chest is assembled, there is one more operation to perform. One more technique that will transform a good joint into an exceptional one. The joiner is going to drawbore the joints. Drawboring is an ancient technique, a secret known to joiners, but not widely understood by others. The principle is simple, but the execution requires precision. A hole is drilled through the assembled joint, passing through both the tail and the pin. Then a tapered wooden peg is driven through the hole. As the peg is driven home, it pulls the joint tight with tremendous force, far more force than could be applied by hand pressure alone. The result is a joint that is not only mechanically locked by the geometry of the dovetails, but also physically compressed by the tension of the pegs. The key to drawboring is the offset. The hole drilled through the tail must be slightly offset from the hole drilled through the pin. When the holes are offset and a peg is driven through, the peg forces the tail to move slightly, pulling the joint even tighter than it was before. This creates compression, and compression is what makes the joint permanent. The joiner begins with one corner. He measures carefully, marking the position for the first drawbore hole. The hole will go through the center of one of the tails, passing completely through the thickness of the board and emerging on the other side. He uses a bradawl to create a small starting hole, twisting the pointed tool to create a depression that will guide the drill bit. The drill he uses is called a brace and bit. The brace is a wooden handle shaped like a crank, with a chuck at the end that holds the bit. The bit itself is a spiral auger, with a sharp point at the tip and cutting edges that spiral up the shaft. When you turn the brace, the bit rotates, the point pulls itself into the wood, and the spiral edges cut away the material, carrying the chips up and out of the hole. The joiner positions the point of the bit in the starting hole and begins to turn the brace. The motion is slow and steady, requiring strength but not speed. The bit cuts into the oak, creating a perfectly round hole. The diameter is perhaps 3/8 of an inch, large enough to accommodate a substantial peg, but not so large that it weakens the wood. He drills until the bit breaks through on the other side, feeling the sudden reduction in resistance as the point emerges. Then he withdraws the bit, clearing the spiral of chips, and examines the hole. It is clean and straight, the walls smooth. This is the tail hole. Now comes the critical part. He disassembles the joint, carefully separating the two boards. The tail hole is clearly visible, passing through the center of one tail. He positions the boards together again, but this time he marks the pin through the tail hole. He pushes a pointed awl through the hole in the tail and makes a mark on the pin beneath. This mark shows where the hole would be if it were perfectly aligned. But the joiner does not drill at this mark. Instead, he moves the mark very slightly toward the baseline, perhaps 1/16 of an inch. This is the offset. When the peg is driven through the offset holes, it will force the tail to move that 1/16 of an inch, pulling the joint tighter. He drills the pin hole at the offset mark. The bit cuts through the oak, creating a second hole that looks identical to the first, but is positioned slightly differently. When he reassembles the joint and looks through the holes from the side, he can see that they do not quite align. There is a small crescent of daylight visible where the two holes overlap, but do not perfectly match. Now he needs a peg. The joiner keeps a supply of pegs in various sizes, stored in a wooden box beside his bench. These pegs are made from hardwood, usually oak or ash, and they are carefully shaped. One end is rounded and smooth, the drive end that will receive the blows of the mallet. The other end is tapered, starting at the full diameter of the hole and gradually reducing to about 3/4 of that diameter over a length of perhaps 2 inches. The taper is critical. As the tapered peg is driven through the offset holes, it encounters resistance when it reaches the point where the holes do not align. The peg cannot compress, but the wood can move. So as the peg is driven deeper, it forces the tail to shift, pulling the joint tighter. The force generated by this action is substantial, measured in hundreds of pounds. It is enough to close tiny gaps, to compress the wood fibers, to lock the joint so tightly that it will never move again. The joiner selects a peg of the appropriate size and positions it in the hole. The tapered end enters easily, sliding through until it reaches the point of offset. Then he picks up his mallet and begins to drive the peg home. Tock. The mallet strikes the peg and it moves a fraction of an inch deeper. Tock. Another strike, another increment. The sound is solid, resonant, the sound of wood driving through wood. Tock. The peg continues to advance and the joiner can feel the resistance increasing. The joint is being pulled together, compressed, locked. Tock, tock, tock. The strikes come steadily, rhythmically. The peg sinks deeper and deeper until finally it bottoms out, the rounded head flush with the surface of the board. The joiner sets down the mallet and examines the joint. He tries to pull the boards apart. They do not move, not even slightly. The combination of the dovetail geometry and the drawbore pegs has created a bond that is effectively permanent. He repeats this process for each joint, drilling holes through the tails, marking the offset, drilling the pin holes, driving the pegs. Each peg locks the joint a little tighter. Each one adds to the structural integrity of the chest. By the time all the pegs are driven, the chest has been transformed from an assembly of separate boards into a unified structure, a single object that will withstand decades of use. The afternoon light slants through the window, golden and warm. The joiner stands back and looks at his work. The chest is assembled, all four corners joined, the bottom panel floating in its grooves. But it is still rough, the surface marked with saw marks and plain tracks. It needs to be refined, smoothed, finished. He begins with his smoothing plane, working over every surface, removing any irregularities left from the earlier work. The plane whispers across the oak, leaving behind a surface that is silky to the touch. The grain of the wood becomes more visible, the figure more pronounced. The medullary rays catch the light, creating subtle flashes of brightness that shift as you move your head. But the plane alone is not sufficient for the finest finish. For that, the joiner uses Dutch rush. This is not a tool but a plant, Equisetum hyemale, a primitive plant related to ferns. It grows in damp places, sending up hollow stems that are jointed like bamboo. The surface of these stems contains silica, tiny particles of glass that make them abrasive. When dried and rubbed over wood, they polish the surface to a smoothness that cannot be achieved by any other means. The joiner keeps bundles of Dutch rush hanging from the rafters, dried and ready for use. He takes down a handful of stems and binds them together into a tight bundle. Then he begins to rub this bundle over the surface of the chest, working with the grain, applying steady pressure. The sound is a soft whisper, almost inaudible. Shhhhhhh. The silica particles abrade the wood fibers, cutting them cleanly at the surface level. Shhhhhhh. The bundle moves back and forth, gradually polishing the wood to a high sheen. The joiner works systematically, covering every surface, every corner, every edge. His arm moves in a steady rhythm, the bundle of rush never pausing, never deviating from its path. The oak responds to this treatment, the surface becoming smoother and smoother. The figure becomes more pronounced, the rays more visible. The color deepens slightly, the pale yellow-brown of fresh-cut oak darkening to a richer, warmer tone. This is the beginning of the patina, the surface character that will continue to develop over years of use and exposure to light and air. When the entire chest has been smoothed with Dutch rush, the joiner sets aside the plant's stems and reaches for his beeswax. The wax is kept in a small leather pouch, a lump about the size of a walnut, slightly soft from the warmth of the workshop. He breaks off a piece and begins to rub it into the wood, working it in with his hands, feeling the surface beneath his fingers. The wax fills the pores of the wood, creating a protective barrier against moisture and dirt. It also enhances the color, enriching the golden tone of the oak. As the joiner rubs, the wax begins to build up a subtle sheen, not glossy like a varnish, but softer, more natural. This is the finish that oak deserves, a finish that lets the wood speak for itself rather than covering it with artificial coatings. He works the wax into every surface, his hands moving in circles, applying pressure to generate heat that helps the wax penetrate. The workshop fills with the gentle scent of beeswax, that honey-sweet smell that mingles with the oak's tannin aroma to create a fragrance that is the essence of the joiner's craft. When the waxing is complete, he takes a clean cloth and buffs the surface, rubbing vigorously to remove any excess wax and bring up the shine. The cloth moves in broad, sweeping motions, the friction generating more heat, the surface becoming smoother and more lustrous with every pass. Finally, it is done. The joiner steps back and looks at the chest. It sits on his bench, the golden oak glowing in the late afternoon light. The dovetails at each corner are visible if you look closely, but they have been so precisely cut that they almost disappear, creating the illusion of continuous wood. The surface is smooth as silk, the grain figure dancing across the panels, the whole piece radiating the quiet beauty that comes from honest materials honestly worked. He runs his hand over the surface one more time, feeling the smoothness, the slight warmth of the wax, the solidity of the oak. This chest will outlive him. It will outlive his children and perhaps his grandchildren. It will serve its owner faithfully, protecting their possessions, standing as a testament to careful craftsmanship and respect for materials. The joiner makes the lid next, following the same process. Frame and panel construction, the frame joined with mortise and tenon joints, the panel floating in grooves to allow for movement. The lid is fitted with iron hinges that he purchased from the blacksmith, simple but strong, forged from good iron that will not rust easily. The hinges are attached with hand-forged nails, driven carefully to avoid splitting the wood. When the lid is attached and he lifts it for the first time, there is a satisfying creak from the hinges, and then the lid swings smoothly upward. The inside of the chest is revealed, the pale oak surfaces clean and smooth. The joiner has smoothed the interior as carefully as the exterior, because good work is good work whether anyone sees it or not. He tests the lid, opening and closing it several times. The motion is smooth, the hinges well fitted. When he closes the lid, it settles onto the top edges of the chest with a solid sound. Thump. The weight of the oak lid creates a good seal, though not airtight. The chest is designed to protect contents from dust and casual theft, not to be a strong box. The final touch is a simple lock, installed in the front panel. The lock is also iron, purchased from the same blacksmith who made the hinges. It is a basic mechanism, a spring-loaded bolt that can be engaged or released with a key. The joiner chisels out a mortise for the lock body, fitting it carefully so it sits flush with the surface. The keyhole is positioned in the center of the front panel, a simple slot that accepts the broad, flat key. He tests the lock, inserting the key and turning it. The bolt slides smoothly into its receiver on the lid. Click. The chest is locked. He turns the key back and the bolt withdraws. Click. The chest is unlocked. The mechanism works perfectly as it should. The chest is complete. The joiner lifts it down from the bench and sets it on the floor, stepping back to view it from a different angle. It is a handsome piece, well proportioned and solidly built. The oak has a beautiful color, that warm golden brown that seems to glow from within. The wax finish gives it a subtle luster without obscuring the grain. Tomorrow he will deliver it to the customer, a merchant who lives on the other side of town. The merchant will use it to store valuable documents and coins, trusting in the strength of the oak and the skill of the joiner to protect his wealth. and the chest will do that faithfully for as long as it exists. But tonight, the work is done. The joiner looks around his workshop, at the shavings scattered across the floor, at the tools on the bench waiting to be cleaned and put away. The light from the window is fading, the sun setting behind the houses across the street. Soon it will be dark. He begins the evening routine. The tools are cleaned first, each one wiped free of sawdust and wax, each one checked for damage or dullness. The plain irons are examined, their edges tested with a thumb. They are still sharp, but tomorrow morning he will hone them anyway, maintaining them in perfect condition. The saws are hung on their racks, the chisels returned to their designated spaces. Everything in its place, everything ready for tomorrow's work. The shavings are swept up, the pile on the bench pushed into the basket, the floor cleared with a broom made of birch twigs. The shavings will be used for kindling or spread as bedding for the animals in the stable behind the house. Nothing is wasted. Every scrap of wood, every curl of oak has a purpose. The apprentice arrives as the last of the light fades from the sky. He lights the candles, their flames small and yellow in the growing darkness. The workshop takes on a different character in candlelight, the shadows deeper, the corners darker. The chest sits near the bench, its surface reflecting the flickering flames, the wax finish catching and holding the light. The joiner removes his apron and hangs it on its peg. He washes his hands in the bucket, drying them on the rag. His hands are tired, the muscles aching slightly from the day's work. But it is a good ache, the ache of productive labor, of work completed to a high standard. He nods to the apprentice and steps out into the evening. The air is cold, carrying the scent of wood smoke from the many fires burning in the town. The stars are beginning to appear overhead, faint points of light in the darkening sky. The joiner pulls his cloak around his shoulders and begins the walk home. His wife has prepared a meal, a simple stew of vegetables and barley with a little meat. They eat together in silence, the comfortable quiet of long familiarity. After the meal, the joiner sits by the fire, warming his hands, feeling the heat penetrate his tired muscles. But his mind is already moving ahead, thinking about the next project. There is a table to build for the priest, a large oak table that will seat 12 people. The design is already complete in his mind, the joinery planned out. Mortise and tenon joints for the frame, breadboard ends on the top to prevent warping. It will be a substantial piece, requiring several days of work, but he is looking forward to it. For now, though, there is rest. The joiner climbs the ladder to the sleeping loft, his body heavy with fatigue. He lies down on the bed, pulling the wool blankets over himself. The mattress is stuffed with fresh straw, rustling slightly as he settles into position. He closes his eyes, and immediately the images of the day's work begin to flow through his mind. The whisper of the smoothing plane across oak, the satisfying click of the lock engaging, the soft sheen of waxed wood in candlelight, the solid thump of the lid closing. Outside, the night deepens. The stars wheel overhead in their ancient patterns. The town sleeps, its inhabitants resting in preparation for tomorrow's work. And in the joiner's workshop, the chest sits in darkness, waiting for morning when it will be loaded onto a cart and delivered to its new home. The chest is solid. The oak is quarter-sawn, stable, unlikely to warp or twist. The dovetails lock the corners with geometry and friction. The drawbore pegs pull everything tight with tremendous force. The finish of beeswax protects the wood while letting its natural beauty show through. This chest will last for generations. It will serve faithfully, protecting what is placed inside it, standing as a monument to careful craftsmanship and respect for materials. The joiner's breathing slows and deepens. His body relaxes, releasing the tension held in muscles and joints. His hands, those broad, capable hands with their calluses and embedded sawdust, rest on the blanket, still and peaceful. The aches fade as sleep approaches, that gentle descent into unconsciousness that comes after a day of honest work. In his dreams, he is still in the workshop. He is planing a board, the triplane moving smoothly across the surface. Shhh, wisp. The shaving curls away, translucent and perfect. He sets the plane aside and picks up his dovetail saw. The teeth bite into the oak, tracking down the marked line. Shiss. The saw whispers through the wood, creating the precise cuts that will become joints. But these are peaceful dreams, not anxious ones. There is no struggle in these dreams, no frustration or failure. Just the steady, satisfying rhythm of skilled work, the transformation of raw material into finished object. Just the quiet pleasure of doing something well, of creating beauty and utility from nothing more than wood and knowledge and practiced hands. The night passes, the moon rises and sets, the stars complete their arc across the sky. The town sleeps, wrapped in darkness and silence. And in the workshop, the chest waits. It is closed now, the lid settled firmly onto the top edges, the lock engaged. Inside the chest, there is only darkness and the faint scent of fresh-cut oak. The space is protected, enclosed, safe. Nothing can enter without the key. Nothing can disturb what rests within. The oak is strong. The joints are tight. The finish is perfect. The chest is complete. And you are safe. You are protected. You are held in the same way the chest holds its contents, surrounded by strong walls, locked away from anything that might harm. The grain of the oak runs through everything, creating continuity, creating strength. The geometry of the dovetails locks you in place, secure and immovable. The workshop is quiet now. The tools are clean and put away. The floor is swept. The candles have burned down to nothing. There is only darkness and silence and the faint scent of beeswax and oak. The chest sits in the darkness, solid and permanent. The lid is closed. The lock is engaged. Inside, everything is still. Everything is quiet. Everything is safe. Close your eyes and feel the weight of the oak lid settling over you. Feel the strength of the quarter-sawn boards surrounding you. Feel the precision of the dovetails holding everything together, locked tight by geometry and friction and the tremendous force of the drawbore pegs. You are inside the chest now. The walls are thick and strong. The finish is smooth beneath your fingers. The scent of oak and beeswax fills the air. It is dark, but it is a comforting darkness, a protective darkness, the darkness of safety and security. The lid is heavy, the oak is solid, the lock is engaged. You are safe. You are protected. You are held. The grain runs through everything, those growth rings that marked the years of the tree's life, now marking the years of your rest. The medullary rays carry strength from the heart of the wood to its surface, carrying strength to you. The chest does not move. The joints do not loosen. The wood does not warp. Everything is stable. Everything is permanent. Everything is at rest. Outside, the world continues, but you are not part of that world now. You are inside the chest, inside the oak, inside the darkness and silence and safety. The joiner sleeps, the apprentice sleeps, the town sleeps, and you sleep too, cradled in oak and beeswax, surrounded by the work of patient hands and careful minds, protected by geometry and friction and wood that has stood for a century and will stand for centuries more. The lid is closed. The lock is engaged. The chest is sealed. And inside, in the darkness, in the silence, in the safety of thick oak walls and precise joints and wax-finished surfaces, you rest. The grain runs through everything. The figure catches what little light remains. The dovetails hold. Sleep now. Sleep in the chest. Sleep in the oak. Sleep.